Okay, our next speaker here today is David Montgomery. David, are you in the room? Would like to welcome him. David's an author. He is passionate about regenerative agriculture. We are so grateful that he's able to be here with us.
Well,
So,
thank you, Jared. You guys hear me?
yes, we can. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay. Want me to
Yeah.
want me to just take it away? I'll
Y-
start sharing my screen. I'll start talking at you. I'm a professor, so I could do that all day.
All right. Sounds perfect. Yep, we came to listen, so we're here.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for letting me share some thoughts on regenerative agriculture and the work that I've been doing over the last I guess about 15 years now. What you see up on your screen now is really what I've been spending nights and weekends for the last 15 years doing, which is writing books on themes related to humanity's relationship to the land, really mediated through our relationship to the soil. And I started off with writing a book called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. My background is as a geologist. I study how the surface of the earth evolves, how erosion works basically, and how it shapes landscapes. And so the first book I wrote about soil was really focused on soil erosion and the long-term problem of soil degradation. That led me into thinking about, well, how might we actually fix these problems? And that led my wife, who's a biologist, and I to write The Hidden Half of Nature together, that looked at how microbial life is really instrumental to maintaining soil fertility. And then Growing Revolution, the third book in this series of 4 books, is one that I wrote really by looking over the shoulder of many regenerative farmers and asking the question of why is what they're doing working, and digging into the science behind that. And What Your Food Ate is the book that Ann and I wrote most recently, that focuses on what regenerative agriculture could mean for human health and human nutrition. So I'm going to try and stuff the summary of 4 books, 15 years worth of work, into about a half hour. And so forgive me if I go fairly quickly. My students accuse me of that all the time, but there's a lot to cover and a lot to talk about. So let's start with the dirt book. I mean, the 3 sort of takeaway bullets on this book are really that societies that don't take care of their soil don't last. That's not a radical new idea. Even the classical Greek philosopher Plato knew that and wrote about it several thousand years ago. The second bullet point is soil erosion and degradation have limited the lifespan of past societies. That's the subtitle of Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, for how people have treated the land in the past and how we're treating it at present, as I'll get into, has really set the clock ticking on the lifespan of civilizations around the world, with only a few exceptions. But remember, I'm a geologist, so I'm talking kind of long-term time frames here, but things that actually matter and then stick to human societies, where our descendants inherit the results of actions from today. And the third bullet point here is really relevant to that, is that soil erosion is not just ancient history. There's been a lot of progress, a lot of knowledge generated since the Dust Bowl era, a lot of programs initiated, but soil erosion today is still a critical global problem. And to illustrate that, I like to use the statistic from the UN's Global State of the Soil Assessment from 2015, a few years ago now, but still valid, where they wrote that humanity loses another 0.3%, a third of a percent, of our global food production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil erosion and degradation. That 0.3% is not a big number in any one year, but if you play that out over the rest of this century, that adds up to the potential loss of about a quarter of our ability to feed ourselves on this planet, when our population is projected to rise by about half. Those numbers are obviously working at cross purposes. So soil erosion is not simply ancient history. But there is a lot of really interesting ancient history around the invention of the plow and how that accelerated the processes of soil erosion in society after society. And that was the real takeaway that I took from writing the Dirt book, was how the invention of the plow dramatically increased both our ability to produce food, but also the pace at which soils eroded in ways that undermined our long-term ability to continue producing high volumes of food. And the story of agricultural society after agricultural society around the world really kind of boils down to an imbalance between the pace at which we're losing soils off of the land that feed ourselves, and the pace at which those soils are rebuilt, either naturally or by farmers. So if you look back through the history of soil erosion around the world, as I did in writing the Dirt Book, I spent a lot of time compiling modern data on soil erosion and modern data on the pace of how fast nature builds soils. And what I found is that modern agriculture, on average, for a global average, erodes about an inch of soil in about 20 years. That's about a millimeter a year. Our fingernails grow faster than that. This is a number that only a geologist would think was screamingly fast, or somebody who is concerned about the intergenerational maintenance and stewardship of the land, because it takes nature some 500 to 1,000 years to remake that inch of fertile soil that today, on average around the world, we're losing in just a couple decades. So if we're losing something in decades and we're replacing it in centuries, there's an imbalance there. And you can actually pencil out, as I did in both the Dirt Book and some academic journal articles, about how you can predict the longevity of human civilizations in the past based on how they treated their land. And to me, that was a real revelation. But the problem of soil degradation is not just one of soil erosion and soil loss. It's also one of the loss of soil organic matter. And this paper in the journal Sustainability from 2015 on North American soil degradation, it was one of these review papers that looks at lots of other studies and then tries to compile conclusions based on that. They concluded that the soil organic matter content, or the amount of carbon in our soils, because soil organic matter is about 60% carbon, that many of the soils across North America is only about 50%, about half of the level that they were at the time that those lands, our agricultural lands today, were first converted from forests or prairies to farmlands. In other words, not only is soil loss an issue, but the degradation of soil organic matter is an issue. And that is an issue in great part because soil fertility is maintained by soil organic matter. You've got to keep the soil on the land to keep it productive, but then keeping the land productive also means keeping the organic matter in the soil, unless one wants to need to compensate for that through other things like the heavy routine use of synthetic fertilizers. So when we think of the state of global farming today and modern farming, there's sort of two characteristics that have really contributed to both soil erosion and the degradation of soil organic matter. And those two factors are really sort of fundamental and underpin modern conventional agriculture, and that's heavy routine tillage and the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. We could get into other agrochemical uses we want. I'll talk a little about soil life more in a minute. But if you look back through the whole sweep of agricultural history, the last 7,000 years, routine tillage and then more recently the use of the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers has contributed greatly to the loss of soil and the loss of soil organic matter. And so the question that I started wrestling with as I wrapped up writing that Dirt Book was, can we actually reverse the historical pattern of soil erosion and degradation? And if so, how fast could we do it? Is it going to take centuries to millennia to repair the damage that agriculture in the past has done to our global soils? Or could we do it much faster? And I'm happy to say that I'm going to switch now from the depressing part of this brief summary of these books to the more optimistic end, because the more I looked into how we might actually restore fertility to the world's agricultural lands, to restore native fertility to the world's agricultural lands, the more I became convinced that not only could we do it, but we could do it really much faster than nature herself rebuilds soils. And that led me to thinking, that really led me to the world of regenerative agriculture. So if conventional agriculture really emphasizes chemistry as the foundation for thinking about soil fertility, regenerative agriculture emphasizes cultivating soil life. And it's maybe kind of odd to think about sort of bringing biology back into the governing philosophy behind conventional agriculture, but that really is kind of what got dealt out when we think of soil biology in terms of conventional thinking about agronomic practices that contemporarily emphasize primarily soil chemistry and soil physics, both of which are super important, but neither of which are adequate for sustaining soil fertility over the long run in terms of how we frame thinking about the soils. So regenerative agriculture takes us in a whole different way of thinking about soils, and I came to really think about that through the process of writing The Hidden Half of Nature with my wife, Anne Baclay, who I mentioned earlier was a biologist, and you think about what is it that makes healthy, fertile soils? It's the marriage of geology and biology. It's the mineral matter, and it's the life in the soil. Because symbiotic microbial allies support the health of both plants and animals and people, as it turns out. Although we've probably all heard about sort of our gut microbiome over the last 10 years or so since this book came out, it's become a very It's permeated all kinds of things. You see ads for, gut microbiome building things on television all the time now. Well, it turns out that soil life acts similarly to our gut microbiome and in fairly similar ways. And the trick to, I think, in terms of bringing soil biology and soil ecology back into the forefront of thinking about agriculture is to think about enlisting literally trillions of tiny helpers in the soil to work with farmers rather than having farmers spend a lot of time, effort, and money working against the life and biology in the soil. And what is the sort of glue that holds all this together? I'm going to skip over a whole lot of interesting science that Ann and I wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature to really focus here on the phenomena of exudates. We probably have all learned that plants build their bodies by taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, combining it with water they drop from their roots through the process of photosynthesis to build their botanical bodies. But there's something else that goes on in the rhizosphere, the literally Greek for the zone around the roots of a plant, that I didn't learn in graduate school soil science classes, a few decades ago, where I was trained to think of roots as straws that sucked up the water to fuel photosynthesis. Well, it turns out that roots are actually two-way superhighways. There's stuff going out of them into the soil as well as stuff coming from the soil into the plants. And that material that's going out into the soil are what are known as exudates. And those exudates are compounds like carbohydrates, like fats, like proteins that plants are dripping out of their roots, like this image of an exudate dripping off of a root hair there, into the soil. And many plants will put up to like 30, and at the highest numbers I've seen are up to almost 50% of what they capture through photosynthesis, they drip out through the roots into the soil. And that sounds absolutely crazy. Why would plants do that unless you start expanding to think about the reasons might relate to the life in the soil? They're essentially creating a biological bazaar in the soil, what I like to call the original underground economy, and Ann always penalizes me for using the pun, but she's not here, so I can get away with it, where if we look at what happens to those exudates, remember the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, food basically, that gets dripped out of the roots of plants, they don't make it more than about a millimeter to a centimeter from a root or root hair before they get consumed by something in the soil, bacteria or fungi. And what do those things do with those exudates? They metabolize them. And where do their metabolites or their waste products end up? Well, right around the roots of a plant, because that's where they are. The plants are setting the subterranean smorgasbord to feed all this microbial life that metabolizes those exudates and turns them into things that the plants can take back up through their roots, because it's right there. And what are those kind of things that the plants can take back up? Well, things like plant growth promoting hormones. They get things like mineral elements that that soil life will mine from the soil, that fungi will go out and fetch from soil particles, bring back, trade them to the plants for the cut of those sugary exudates. And bacteria in the rhizosphere will metabolize compounds and turn them into things that are beneficial for the health of plants. So when we stand back and we think about how you raise healthy crops, and how you raise biomass, that's not always the same answer. Well, we know that on a fertilizer diet, if you put enough N, P, and K, enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium into the soil, you can grow large amounts of biomass, even in fairly degraded soils. But the plants don't put that much. They don't invest as much in their root system because they don't need to produce as many exudates to actually get what they need to grow fairly large. But they get shortchanged on the mineral micronutrients and the beneficial metabolites that the beneficial bacteria and fungi in the soil will produce in a symbiotic relationship in exchange for those exudates. But plants that are on the sort of the easy train of chemical fertilizers, they don't invest as much in exudates, and that scuttles the relationships they have with life in the soil. A soil health diet, on the other hand, for plants that grow in really carbon-rich, organic matter-rich, healthy, fertile soils, they will invest in the root system and in producing exudates. They don't need as much in the way of N, P, and K to achieve the same biomass, and they will get larger components of mineral micronutrients and beneficial metabolites in what Ann and I call a soil health diet. So there's different ways to think about the role of life in the soil for agricultural production. What are the kind of micronutrients that plants will get from those partnerships with life in healthy, fertile soils? Well, things like iron and zinc and selenium. And particularly micronutrients like zinc are things that a plant doesn't need that much of, but they do need it to for their defensive systems and enzymes, just like we need it to support our immune system. And plants will also make phytochemicals, plant-made chemicals, in response to the stimuli from soil life. And what do phytochemicals really do? Well, phytochemicals actually control a lot of communication between plants. Think about how plants communicate with one another. They don't have vocal cords. They communicate with a chemical language. And it's a very active communication that happens between plants and life in the soil, such that when certain plants can get nibbled on by insect herbivores, they will send out a signal down to their leaves, down to their roots that produce exudates that will recruit microbes that consume those exudates, transform them into metabolites that the plant takes back up, that then makes the plant taste bad for those insect pests. Phytochemicals are central to plant defense and also for protection. The beta carotene, for example, that we know of in coloring squash and carrots, for example, giving that orange color. You'll find it in sunscreens because it's a great UV protector. So plants are making phytochemicals for their own purposes, to support their health, and they do it in partnership with soil life, and they pay that soil life with exudates. So healthy, fertile soils are essentially nature's health plan for both soil or for crops, and the key is keeping the soil on the land and keeping the organic matter in the soil. When Ann and I finished writing, digging into the world of soil microbiology to write The Hidden Half of Nature, I was left with questions about, well, can we really restore soil on working farms around the world? So I took 6 months off from the University of Washington, where I teach, and I traveled around the world to visit regenerative farmers who are restoring fertility to their land remarkably fast. And what I found is that they can do it. It's been done. There can be challenges in figuring out how to do it and adapting the principles I'll lay out in a minute to different environments. But I came away with the bottom line that farming and ranching could put a lot of carbon back in the ground, which has broad societal interest, but it also can be done in ways that helps improve the profitability of farms. So in visiting these farms around the world that had been very successful at rebuilding the fertility of their land in short order, what I came away with was that there's a simple set of principles that are listed up here, that USDA has a similar set, Understanding Ag has a similar set with a few modifications. But basically, the farmers that I visited who've been very successful at rebuilding their soil fertility all used minimal disturbance, so they used low or no-till methods. They always kept their soil covered. They used cover crops extensively, or always kept a cash crop in the ground. And they had diverse crop rotations, at least 3 or 4 or 5 or more crops on the same piece of land. They were not just growing 1 or 2 crops in a pseudo rotation. And many of them had also reintegrated animal husbandry into their operations. And if you think about these ideas of sort of minimal disturbance, keeping the soil covered, and diversifying crop rotation, that is fairly unconventional in terms of the world of conventional practices today. What could the suites of practices do to soils? What I found is that they rapidly rebuilt soil organic matter and reintroduced soil life. And I'll just show you this one example from David Brandt's farm in Carroll, Ohio here, where it's showing you the soil that he started with back in 1971. And after going through a series of modifications where he ultimately ended up with that combination of no-till, cover crops, and diversity, his soil was looking like this by 2014. These are literally from across the road from one another. The difference here was that David's regenerative practices turned that khaki stuff into that rich dark chocolate cake that has more carbon in it than the native soils of the forest in that area. This shows you David at his farm, but what really sort of started me in thinking along the lines of this presentation today was the economics that he walked through on his farm, because he basically walked me through the difference between his operation and his neighbor's operation across the field there. Where on the county average, they were doing full tillage, 200 pounds of nitrogen an acre, 2.5 quarts of Roundup. The total cost in 2015, the year I was visiting them, was about $500 an acre. Their corn yield was 100 bushels an acre, and at $4 a bushel they were getting then, his neighbors were losing $100 for every acre of corn they planted. Even a geologist can tell you that that's a pretty bad business model. David's farm, on the other hand, in that same year, where he'd been doing no-till for 44 years with cover crops for a decade or so before that, or before I visited, he was not tilling, so he saved on diesel. He was using only 24 pounds of nitrogen per acre and 1 quart of Roundup. He was not an organic farmer, but he was using minimal chemical inputs. His total costs were 320 bucks an acre. His yield was 180 bushels an acre, 80% higher than his conventional neighbors on average. And at 4 bucks a bushel, he was making 400 bucks an acre. He had a very profitable farm using very different methods, using regenerative methods at a time when his neighbors were actively losing money. I'll show you one more example on the economics here. Kofi Boa's farm in near Kumasi, Ghana, where he taught his local villagers to how to move away from their traditional practices of slash and burn agriculture to a no-till style with cover crops and great diversity in their fields. It basically shut off the erosion problem that they were having with their traditional farming. That was, part of why they were having to move around to different patches of forest every year, a few years to farm. But notice what happened to their yields. Their corn yield tripled from 1.5 tons a hectare to 4.5 tons, and their cowpea yield doubled, 0.8 tons to 1.5 tons. For farmers that lacked capital, these were subsistence farmers, that was a game changer in terms of the economics of their farms. And these guys are not just one-off examples. Jonathan Lundgren, who I believe is speaking here as well, and Claire Lacan published this wonderful paper in the journal Peer J a few years back, right after Growing Revolution came out, where they compared the revenue and profits for farms, corn farms in the American Midwest that were conventional and regenerative. And the way you read this graph is it's revenue or cost over on the y-axis, conventional on the left, regenerative on the right. So the top bar is how much they harvested off the fields. You notice that the regenerative yield was higher. But notice also that all these colored things, all the things the farmers spent money on, were smaller on the regenerative than the conventional. So the regenerative farmers were spending less to harvest more. They were, that's a recipe for a more profitable farm. And that's what started me into starting to think, starting me down the road of optimism in thinking that these regenerative soil building practices could really catch on, because if you're going to have sustainable farming, you have to be able to sustain the farm. The economics have to work out. So one of the basic benefits that I found from rebuilding healthy soils, of reversing this, centuries-long pattern of humanity degrading the land that we depend on to feed ourselves, is it can actually be more profitable for farmers in the world we have today with low commodity prices and high input prices. It can be more profitable to go the regenerative way, because they use less fertilizer, pesticide, and fossil fuels to produce comparable yields. There could be a transition period that, in my experience in interviewing farmers, was relatively short. But there's also larger scale societal incentives to try and help incentivize and presumably compensate farmers for their efforts in regenerative farming. And that is, that it puts more carbon in the soil and can retain more water in the soil, which means farms will be more climate resilient and less off-site pollution. The single best way to reduce the nitrate and phosphate pollution off of farms in the agricultural arena is to use less of those inputs in the first place. And that brings me to the fourth book, What's Your Food Aid, that focused on the relationship between soil health and human health. In the last couple of minutes here, I'll go briefly through some of those connections. What's Your Food Aid was a real dive down into both the agricultural and the medical literature. If you're interested in all the science behind this particular book, we read literally 1,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers and journals to synthesize it down into this book. And you can download that full list of references at our website that I'll show you at the end here. But basically, the takeaways from What's Your Food Aid were that farming practices can really affect dietary levels of phytochemicals, vitamins and minerals, omega-3 and 6 fats, which are particularly pertinent for livestock operations, and for grass-fed in particular, being rich in omega-3s, and microbial metabolites. Now, I don't have time to share all those each of those pieces with you, but I am going to focus briefly on phytochemicals here. But there's everything you might want to know about those connections that we could find in the scientific literature, we synthesized into the book, and it's very readable. But I'm a little biased. So let's look at phytochemicals. The phytochemicals are things that have been shown to have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory capacities in our bodies. And what are the sources that we get our phytochemicals from? Well, fruits and vegetables are a big source, but meat and dairy can be as well, depending on how they're raised. 100% grass-fed meat and dairy can be rich in phytochemicals, whereas feedlot-fed is kind of devoid of them. We go into the why behind that in the book, but the key point here is that we can only get those sources in our diet. So how what we are eating is raised influences the amount of phytochemicals, the vitamins and minerals, and the fat balance, and so on of what we get to our food. It goes down the hatch, down into where the human microbiome lives in the colon, in the basement of our digestive system. And what does the human microbiome do with phytochemicals? Well, it's another case of microbial metabolites, just like around the roots of plants. The human microbiome will metabolize phytochemicals and turn them into compounds that our body takes up because they're down there in our digestive system that turn out to have anti-cancer properties, anti-diabetic properties, anti-inflammation properties that support brain health, that support heart health. We go through the whole sort of list of those kind of connections in the book, and lay out the science behind it all. But the key thing here is that it connects how we treat the land to what gets into our food and how that then can affect us in terms of helping us, particularly in the management of chronic diseases, which plague so many people today in the westernized and developed world. And I see I'm just about out of time here, which is perfect because this is my last slide. But as a geologist, what I have learned by looking into the processes that degraded land in past civilizations and the science behind how you can turn this kind of infertile soil into this kind of really fertile soil. And this, just for reference here, is what Anne did to our yard as a gardener that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature. Turned 1% organic matter stuff, once you take all those wood chips that we added later on, and turned it into this really rich, dark chocolate, healthy, fertile soil. There's regenerative farming and regenerative gardening follow the same principles. And in the end, what's good for the land really is good for us too. So obviously, I recommend all these books for you. It's been a fun sideline and hobby. I mean, I make my living teaching about geology in college, but we're at a point in time now where this idea of regenerative agriculture has really come of age. And put simply, soil health translates into crop health, livestock health, and ultimately into human health. I encourage you to check all this stuff out. If you want to get a preview of the books, go to digtogrow.com. You can get a preview from there. Many libraries have them, and of course, any bookstore or Amazon or wherever you like to get your books has copies as well. So that's really what I had to say, and I think I'm probably out of time. So I will stop.
That is just perfect.
Sure.
Yeah. If you can see, I've got 3 of the books there.
Oh, awesome.
Hey, there we are. There we are. Don't have your new one yet. But yeah, I'm an Audible reader, but these were good enough books that I'm like, okay, I need to own the copy of the books as well, besides just having the audio version. Highly recommend them.
Obviously encourage that. And, keeping the books in print is a wonderful thing to do. I obviously encourage people to buy them, but I also encourage you to share them, pass them around. Writing is about sharing ideas, not making money.
Yeah. And to that end, for those who stick on to the end, I will gift if it was 3, it would be a trilogy. What are 4? What do you call a set of 4 books?
A quad.
A quad. Okay. I will gift the quad to some lucky winner here at the end of today. So stick around to the end. That's reason enough. Awesome, David. Thank you so much.
Thanks for letting me speak, and best of luck to everybody.
Okay. Yep. Wonderful. Take care.